Greetings, it is I, Tentus Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue our discussion on Shadowrun. I've been talking about magic in the Awakened world, and now we're moving from spellcasting and sorcery, which we were talking about before, to conjuring, or summoning creatures. Let's just dive into the basics of it. So, when you are using conjuring, you're using it to call, dismiss, or control a spirit, which are using skills to summon, bind, or banish. Now, a spirit is an astral creature, as I've previously mentioned before, so it is completely made of mana, but it can physically manifest in our world. They hate doing it, to no passion, to no end. They just dislike it completely, but they can. Now, there are 6 common types of spirits, but these aren't the only types of spirits. There are a vast variety of types of spirits, but when you usually talk about the common types, these are the 6 you would list. There's air, beasts, earth, fire, man, and water. Now, hermetic mages use a certain selection of them, 5 of them, and so do shamanic mages, 5 of them. They have different lists apiece, so that each set would have a different group of spirits in different functionality. Now, as I said, this is a creature of the astral plane that exists primarily there. As long as it is in the astral plane and not manifesting, which again, it hates to do, then its attributes will be based upon its force. All of them will be equivalent to that, and it can get any kind of actions that it normally would in astral space, like any other astral creature would. At this point in time, as if you have it astral, it can only do actions related to that, and therefore, if you have it do some of your services, which I will talk about in a minute, you're doing it related to the astral plane. As a complex action, it can shift in between the astral and the material plane, so it can then go physically manifest itself at any time, really. Now, when it is physically manifested, its stats are based around a stat block, which it says, which still depends on force, but it also depends on the type of spirit you've summoned. Different spirits have different statistics at this point in time. Now, spirits do not like manifesting because they technically are vulnerable at that point in time, that physical effects can affect them because they are dual nature. They are both astral and physical when they are manifested. So I could do something as a normal person and possibly damage that spirit. It's not gonna like that. It doesn't like being vulnerable to our real world stuff. Now, normally when you see one, they're either the size of a normal metahuman or smaller. They don't really find themselves bigger than a metahuman, ever. It is also important to note they are not affected by gravity the way you and I are. So if a spirit is just floating there, it's not doing anything to defy gravity. It's just not affected by it. Now, when they get into combat, either if they're physically manifested or astral, they will use the normal combat rules for each of those. Physical combat rules, it's going to use the normal physical rules. If it's an astral combat, it's going to use those rules. I will discuss those a little later. Now, it does have one advantage when it is physically manifested, that it gets a bonus. It gets immunity to normal weapon damage. What this special ability means is it gets twice its force as an armor rating against any attacks against it. That means if you summon a relatively powerful force spirit, it's gonna be hard to damage with real-world weapons. Not impossible. And that is why it doesn't like that. If it takes damage, it has its own physical condition that eventually will fill up. If it fills up a physical condition, it is disrupted and returned to its home plane. Any services you had with it are then lost. Any remaining ones, I should note. Now, you as the summoner are linked to your spirit, so should it be disrupted and go away, you will be instantly aware of it. So you will know the condition of your spirit effectively, that it is still there or gone. Now let's talk about services, because services are the tasks that a spirit can do for you. When you summon it, it has a certain number of tasks that are dependent on how successful you were at your summoning test. The more of the net successes you get, the more services you acquire to use your spirit for. You must use all your spirit's services before the next sunrise or sunset, whichever comes first. Now, services are one continuous task that you're going to have a spirit do for you. One kind of action it's going to do. This could be something like using a power. Using one power, whether it's on a single or multiple targets, it counts as one use of a service. If you wanted to use a different power all of a sudden, it would use another service. On the other hand, if you are fighting and asking the spirit to fight for you, whatever your enemies would be, that would also be considered one service. So it might use some of the very powers you were talking about inside of that service, but it would be more its option as it thinks is appropriate, rather than you ordering it directly to use that power. Now, the spirit can also do what is appropriate to its physical form. For example, if you summon a fire spirit and it's made of fire, it can burn things. So whatever form it appears in as its spirit or spirit type intrinsically reflects any kind of special things it may be able to do in the material world when summoning it. Now, your spirit has normally actually a range of 100 meters per point of magic you have. The thing is, your connection to your spirit lasts way beyond that. Your connection to the spirit can be anywhere in any plane or anywhere in the material world. Distance doesn't matter for that connection. And here's where it makes a difference. You can continue to command that spirit as long as it's within that range, but beyond that range, you can still have your spirit do things. That is why the connection continues beyond there, because it can go anywhere. The only thing is, once you've sent your spirit beyond that range, it no longer becomes a normal service, it becomes a remote service. When a spirit is tasked with a remote service, that becomes the only / last service it's going to do for you. That meaning I'm sending it out beyond my normal scope of control of it. Any remaining services I have go away. But that spirit is then tasked with something that goes way beyond my normal limits of being in direct connection to the spirit. So I could, of course, send it way far away to do things, to do something across the world if I really wanted to. It's a remote service. It will travel there and attempt to do it to the best of its ability, and when it's complete the task, its services are done and it goes away. Now let's talk about binding spirits and services. Now, just as a quick note, a bound spirit, it hates that. You're effectively kind of enslaving it a little bit. You're putting it under a more directly stronger amount of control. And there are some spirits which can resist this, especially if you don't treat your spirits very well, because they aren't just inanimate things. They have personalities and existences. So when you maltreat them, they might do things that would disrupt you. You could have a bound spirit near to you, and it could impose a -2 dice pool per bound spirit that you have that dislikes you, to all your dice checks, similar to what sustaining a spell does. Now let's just say you're on good terms with your bound spirit, even though it probably still is disliking you for binding it in the first place. You get all the normal services you would, but you do not lose those at sunset or sundown. You effectively have the services of the bound spirit for as long as the binding remains, or as long as you continue to rebind it, which you could possibly do. I will talk about that in a later episode. You can also then summon or dismiss your connection to it as a simple action rather than complex, which it normally would be to summon it. So it is actually easier to bring forth a bound spirit or to get rid of it. Now, there are some advantages to a bound spirit. First one, you don't lose the remainder of your services if you send it out on a remote service. I could send my bound spirit to do a remote service and it would retain all the other services I still had with it. That means it could go do that remote service, it would come back to me, and I'd still have more services to it. Now, bound spirit can be loaned out. I could give control of it to another magician or even a mundane person. Now, they would be using its services just like you then, so if they would use up its services, you wouldn't get it back. But effectively, for a period of time, you could be not in less contact with the spirit, giving it to someone else to use, like, hey, buddy, there, just my friendly spirit here that I have will go with you and help you out. Granted, I might lose it if the guy uses up all its services, but for that period of time, I'm lending it out. Now, you can do a couple of things that a spirit can do, that a bound spirit can do because it is such long term. It can aid you in spell casting. This is just not normal spells, it can also be ritual spells, that it can give you bonus dice just like any other person would be aiding you in this task. It can aid you in research. This is researching something like a new spell and developing it. It can aid you in that. And then it can also sustain a spell for you. You can choose to remove a sustained spell from your control and give it to your spirit's control. It can maintain it for its force in combat turns per service. That means if I had a force 4 spirit, it could sustain a spell on me for 4 combat turns per service I have on it. The more services, of course, it uses up, the more it would use up of that. Now there is one other thing: you can spell bind a spirit. And this is actually kind of horrible, and spirits will hate you if you spellbind. Spellbind means I am choosing a long-term spell that I want my spirit to maintain for me. That means I'm choosing to sustain a spell for days on end. The spirit will maintain my spell for its force in days, and then it will lose one permanent force. So it will continually lose force. Every time you go force in days, if it's sustaining the spell on you, it loses that. If its force reaches 0, it is gone. It ceases to exist. It basically is destroyed utterly and completely. That is why spirits hate spellbinding so much. And the thing is, spirits know when you've been doing things, regardless of what they've been summoning. And that is why binding a spirit, perhaps at that point in time, it might give you some hassle if you've been spellbind. It makes spirits very reluctant to use this ability and very resistant at it, and using it consumes your remaining services. Now, as I noted earlier, spirits have personalities and minds of their own, and game masters should remember that and reflect it appropriately when summoning spirits. They're not just tools, they're creatures, and it should be reflected appropriately in how you play them up. So that's it for today. I introduced you to Conjuring and talked about the basics of spirits and understanding them, knowing the kind of things you can do, getting services from them, and what those services could possibly be. And the next time, I'm going to go more into details on the 3 actions you can do with Conjuring: summoning, binding, and dismissing. So if you have any questions, comments, anything we say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, subscribe to support the channel, the Empire, the work I do. If you want to show some more support, you can check out the link to my Patreon down in the description. Regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.